in Isaiah 53, the King James says that he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was on him, and by his stripes we're healed. In the Message translation, it says, everything that was wrong with us is what he carried. And there can be a lot of things, that's pretty broad. There can be a lot of things wrong. There can be a lot of difficulties. We can make mistakes. Other people can make mistakes. And maybe it's not even, you can't even attribute it, but it's wrong. It's something that's wrong. And what I read in Isaiah 53, I like the Message, the fact that it broadens it and says all the things wrong with us, and he carried. And I believe that's the message. I believe that's the essence of it, that Jesus, when he came into this world, came into a world of trouble and where things are messed up, where things are wrong, where there's problems, where there's things that are causing pain. And what we read about him in the Gospels is that wherever he went, well, I think Peter summed it up very well in Acts chapter 10 when he was preaching at that Roman centurion's house. Those people that didn't know about Jesus. And they'd seen an angel, and the angel said, go over to this other town and this house, and told him the street address even. And they went there, and Peter was up on the housetop praying. We know this story, and they were knocking on the door, and Peter finally got through to him in that vision that he had, that he was supposed to go with them and preach to them, because they didn't know. They didn't know these things. They didn't know anything. So Peter, when he went to their house, Cornelius, the Roman centurion, and I suppose all of his associates and servants and people, they had been praying. They were looking for God, but they didn't know about Jesus. And so Peter was introducing Jesus to them. And in a very familiar scripture, that's where this comes from, in the process of his message to them, he said how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Ghost and power. And here's what he did. He went around doing good and healing those oppressed by the devil. God put his Holy Spirit on Jesus, and then he had a mission. And so he went around, I like the way he said, he just went around doing good. And the way Peter said it, healing those that were oppressed by the devil. Another way of saying it is lifting the burdens off of people who were carrying these heavy weights. That's why he said, come to me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. In other words, I will lift the burdens off of you. And I believe that's his intent, and that's what is still his heart is for us and for everybody in the world, really. But, we don't need to speak so broadly about the world. We have our concerns that our burdens. I think he wants to lift those off. And as you said a moment ago, I think that's what grace is. If you want to say there's a grace for that, that's good. But I think grace encompasses all those things. There is grace, God's favor for every part of our lives, anything that's a burden, anything that's pain, anything that's not right. Isaiah, the thing about the prophets in the Old Testament, the primary thing that God spoke through them to get on the record, you might say, was the coming of this Jesus who would come. Well, the prophet said why he would come, and I thought of one as we were talking just a moment ago. Isaiah said, he will make the crooked places straight. Every mountain will be brought low, and every valley will be exalted. And he wasn't saying that to talk about geography. He was using those geographical terms or language as a metaphor, talking about people. Whatever is crooked, he came to make it straight. Whatever was low and cast down, he came to exalt it and lift it up. And I think that's still his ministry. I think that's still his heart. And it's a very simple thing. I don't think we need to convince him or to twist his arm or to get his attention. What I read is that his attention is focused on our lives. One of the New Testament writers says, it was Peter, he said, cast all your cares on him, for he careth for you. I like what the Amplified says, watchfully and attentively. He cares about the things that concern us. I was thinking as we were singing, I might read this little passage here from John's Gospel in chapter 1. John, according to Bible scholars and people who study these things, and just from the evidence of how it reads, it's pretty clear that John wrote his gospel later, after the others. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us a pretty straightforward account of Jesus' birth and his life and his ministry and the things that he did and the things that he said as he carried out this grace-filled ministry that we were talking about, lifting the burdens from people, healing those that were sick, casting out the devil where he encountered him, speaking words of comfort, and like Isaiah said, lifting up every valley shall be exalted, and those who are proud and arrogant and fighting against him, he spoke to them in a way that humbled them. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, the hypocrites. But this was all part of his ministry of grace, and the gospel writers Matthew, Mark, and Luke record all of these things in a pretty straightforward way. John, however, takes a different approach, and he comes at it almost from a theological point of view, or a more spiritual point of view, rather than just telling you a straightforward story. For example, in John's Gospel in chapter 1, it says, here's how he starts, and this is very familiar, you've heard it before, of course. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, when we read that in the English language, that conjures up maybe an image that is not what John intended to convey. When we read the Word, we picture the Bible. And I don't think that's what he's saying. I don't think he's saying that in the beginning was the Bible, and we might picture a Bible floating around out in space somewhere. That's not what he's trying to say. John, writing in the Greek language, these gospel writers, they were living in a culture that was shaped by language, and the Greek language was the language of intellectual discourse. And in the world of the first century, the great intellectual thinkers who sort of set the stage for intellectual discourse were the Greek philosophers, like Plato and Aristotle. And John is here using a word that was part of their lexicon. And when it says word here, in the King James translation, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The actual Greek word that is translated word is a Greek word logos, L-O-G-O-S. And the Greek philosophers had a very elaborate concept of what this word logos meant. And I think that's what John was he was borrowing their word, and let me tell you what they thought of it, but he's using it and say this is about Christ. See, the Greeks, especially Plato had this idea that the world we experience and that the things that we see in the physical world is not the true nature of things. And in many ways, it's very much like the concept that Christians have as well. Plato believed that the physical world was imperfect, and that everything in this physical world was flawed and imperfect. But he said, in the invisible world, that's the perfect world. That's where perfection is, the realm of perfect ideas. And sometimes, this example is used. If I say to you, triangle, you can picture in your mind a triangle. And the triangle you're visualizing in your mind is a perfect triangle. But if you sit down to draw it with a pencil, your representation of that perfect triangle you imagine in your mind is not going to come out perfect. No matter how good you are, your triangle that you draw on a piece of paper is not going to be as perfect as the one that is invisible. So what he's saying is the concept of perfection, that's the logos, this translated word here. The concept of what's perfect, the perfect reality in the invisible realm. And John has borrowed that idea here, and he said, in the beginning was the logos in Greek language, the perfect reality. What's perfect? What's God's perfect will? Untainted by this physical world, but perfect and pure and absolute and ultimate. That's what the idea here is. And he says, in the beginning, it was perfect. And that's with God. And the Word, or the Logos, so that ultimate perfect reality was God, it says. And the same was in the beginning with God. Now the reason he's not saying it is God, he's saying it's with God. Well, he does say it is God, but he's meaning to say he's going to say this is Christ. Let's go on reading. He said, the same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not the light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came into his own, and his own received him not. Speaking of Israel. But then he says, John says, but as many as received him. You see, that's all he was looking for from us. As many as received him. That is to say, accept him. Enter into a relationship with him. When I read this word, as many as received him, when I read the word received, it makes me think of, if somebody comes to the door of your house and knocks on the door of your house, you have a choice whether to let them in or not. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I look out through the peephole and and sometimes, I hate to admit this, sometimes I have played possum, and you know what I mean by that. You know, play possum. Pretend nobody's home, because I didn't want to talk about the Watchtower today, if you know what I mean. Anyway, not throwing too many stones at, they're doing what they think is right. But sometimes I don't feel like talking about it. Sometimes I'm busy. Sometimes I got other things I need to do besides say, no, I don't want the Watchtower today. But here's the point. You have a choice. You don't have to just, you open the door and let in who you want to come in, right? That's what it means to receive. Jesus, even in Revelation, he says, I stand at the door and knock. And if any man will open to me, I will come into him. And so that's, how John presents it here. Jesus is one standing at the door and knocking. And what a Christian is, just somebody who opened the door and said, yes, you can come in. It doesn't mean that we are, perfect or better than anybody else, but we've let him in. Now, who is it that we let in, and what's the ramification of that? Well, let's go on reading. He said, as many as received him, to them, those who receive him, to them he gave power. That word power is not the word for force in the Greek language. It's not, dunamis means force in the Greek language. It's not the word that's translated power or force. It's the word that's translated privilege or right, or sometimes authority, exousia. And sometimes we say it means authority. It also means privilege, or that's in the context here, I think that's a better way to understand it. As many as received him, to them he gave the privilege to become the sons of God, even to them which believe on his name. That's all we do. We open the door and receive him, and we believe in him. We place our trust in him. It says in verse 13, which are born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. Now, this is the interesting thing. Right after that, he says, and the Word was made flesh. Now, this is going back to what he first said in verse 1. We said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This perfect reality, the reality of complete and perfect fullness of God that he says was in the beginning, the perfect reality that's in the invisible world. He says now it's come into this physical world. It's invaded this world where we live. When it says the Word was made flesh, it means that perfect reality of God came into this world where things are crooked, where things are not what they should be, where things are imperfect, where there's pain, where there's hurt, where there's frustration, where there's difficulties, and things that are not perfect. This perfect reality has come into this imperfect world. That's what flesh is. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. It says, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten, the Father. And listen what it says about him. Full of grace and truth. Grace is the Greek word charis, which means God's gift, full of God's gifts. We could say it that way. And truth. The word that's translated truth means reality. He was full of the reality of what's really true, of what God is really like. And he's full of God's gifts, we could say, full of grace. In verse 15 it says, John bare witness of him, and cried, saying, this is he of whom I spake. He that cometh after me is preferred before me, and he was before me. And now, so we just read that he came and he was full of God's grace, and full of God's truth, full of God's gifts of grace, we might say. And verse 16 now, John says, and of his fullness have all we received grace for grace. I like how he emphasizes that. Out of the perfect reality and the overflowing fullness of him, we have all received. He came to, you might say, to convey it to all of us, or to make it real for all of us. I like what the Amplified says. Since I don't have Torrin to put it up on the words today, I'm going to look it up. I believe Torrin will be back with us next week. Let's see here. I got to look it up here. And you should see the print is like little ants' footprints. But I have my glasses on, so I am going to read it to you. The Amplified Translation says, verse 16 is what King James says, and of his fullness have all we received grace for grace. I like what the Amplified says. For out of his fullness, his abundance. You see, he's the one who came from and lives in and knows about and is the perfection of God, the fullness. But he came and was made flesh, and he entered into this world where we experience something other than that. For out of his fullness or his abundance, we have all received. And here's what the Amplified adds: we have all had a share, and we're all supplied with one grace after another, one spiritual blessing upon spiritual blessing, and favor upon favor, and gift heaped upon gift. Don't you like the way that reads? If it doesn't tell you anything else, it tells you what his will is, what his intent is, to come and heap upon us favor after favor, gift upon gift, one blessing after another. And this is all in the context of his grace, his unmerited favor. Now, he doesn't say here, if you're good enough, He might give you a little bit of it. He says he has just come with this in mind, giving freely, opening, you might say, the storehouse of heaven freely, blessing each one of us. Who? Those who receive, those who believe. And as Christians, that's what we do. And see, what I draw from that is that in this world that we know, I don't have to convince you that we live in a world that's flawed, and we're confronted on all sides with difficulties and issues from time to time. Just like Kay was talking about earlier, when it seems like I talk about Paul all the time. Well, Paul had a lot of difficulties, but he's the one who said, I found out that, when I was going to the Lord about this, he said, listen, Paul, my grace is enough for you. My unmerited favor. He pours grace and His unmerited favor and His gifts of grace into our lives to make right whatever is wrong, to supply whatever is lacking, to make straight whatever might have gotten out of alignment. And it doesn't even make any difference how it got that way. It doesn't make any difference how things came to be that way. He just wants to make it right. Just like that story we read sometimes in John chapter 9 where they found the man born blind, and the disciples got all obsessed with who sinned that this man was born blind? How did it get this way? Who sinned? Was it him? Was it his parents causing him to be born? Like in their mind there was this cause and effect. Somebody sinned, and so God, either threw him out to be dealt with by these terrible forces, or God directly. It's like somehow there was this direct connection. And I like what the Message says. Jesus said, listen, disciples, you're asking the wrong question. You're just looking to fix blame. There's no cause and effect here. Let's instead be looking for what God can do. Here I am. I'm the light of the world. That's what he said. Right in that context, he said, I'm the light of the world. In other words, this that you're looking at here, this is a little example of darkness. This isn't supposed to be this way. So instead of, getting obsessed with how did it happen, who's to blame, let's just stop and say, okay, here we are. What can God do? And you know what he did right away? He made it right. That's the next thing he did. What can God do? So then of course, the way he did it. See, I'm not one that says we should go around and imitate Jesus in his ministry. Because what Jesus did next was he spit on the ground and stirred the mud around, stuck it on that guy's eyes. And I'm just saying, I would never feel comfortable doing that. I mean, it would be a strange situation. I can't imagine any circumstance where somebody came to me with a difficulty or a problem or said, would you pray for me? And I spit on the ground and stir it up with my finger and stick it in their eye. I just can't picture doing that. But that's what Jesus did. Then he told the guy, go wash it off. And so when the man came back from doing what Jesus told him to do, he washed it off. And what he had washed off was everything that was wrong. So what that tells me is Jesus, as the light of the world, comes to shine into any kind of manifestation of darkness. Anything that's wrong, anything that's a problem, anything that's not right, that doesn't reflect, what is his will here? I closed the book here. I remember what it said. Grace after grace, gift after gift, blessing upon blessing. Anything that doesn't conform to that, he wants to conform it to that. So what do? How do we access it? Well, the same thing we just read here, where it says, he came unto his own, but his own received him not. As many as received him, to them he gave the privilege to become the sons of God, to them that believe on his name. I think this is the example for us that when we in our lives are confronted with the difficulties that we face, first of all, we should know that the Word was made flesh, that perfect reality of God has entered into our human experience. And that's still what his game plan, if I can say it that way, is to enter into our human experience to make it right. See, all the things that we deal with, all the things that confront us, all the problems that we face, he's right there to enter into it His perfection and His abundance and His reality and His grace. If you come into all of our imperfection and our lack and our frustrations and problems, He wants to just straighten it out. Well, we want Him to, don't we? I think we do. I think we do. So what do? Well, as far as I could tell, as I read the New Testament, there's only one thing that He tells people to do again and again: to believe, to trust. Again, I just keep having to, I feel like I need to keep emphasizing the fact that believe doesn't mean just mentally acknowledge that something is true. It means to trust or to rely on or to place our confidence in Him. And I think it's all right just to say specifically. In fact, that's what Paul said. He said, don't have any care or any anxiety or any worry about anything, but instead, by petition, bring your requests to God with thanksgiving, and the peace of God will keep your hearts and minds. I think it's just as simple as that. I think that's the whole intent of prayer, that we just come to Him with our burdens, come to Him with our difficulties, come to Him with our issues, and we say, okay, you've got the answer, I've got the difficulty, but you've got the power to straighten it out. So I'm going to bring it to you, and here it is, and now you straighten it out. And I'm just going to keep thanking you for doing it. That doesn't mean, by the way, that we don't, as we've talked about many, many times, doesn't mean, though, that we don't have to walk through our life and see how it works out. But I believe He can work it out. I believe He can straighten anything out. Don't you believe that? I don't know, I don't know the specifics, but I believe He can, and I believe He does, and I believe that's His will. And all I know is we bring to Him what's wrong, and His attitude and His heart is to make it right. And so we just say amen, and I'm just looking to see it all made right. Aren't you? I believe He can. I believe He will. Okay, I think that's all I got today. Let's all stand up. I like the fact that He has been made flesh, and He comes into our reality to help us.